Welcome. This is the 6th video in the Series 1 about the law of God. We have looked at what Jesus called the first and great commandment and how it is related to every other commandment of God. Since the core of the great commandment is to love Yahweh your God, it makes sense to ask, how do I do that? We have addressed this question in earlier videos, but this time I want to get a clear answer from the Bible. You don't have to look far to find a biblical answer. The Great Commandment is first proclaimed by Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. And immediately following that, Moses explained to the Israelites what the commandment means. We read this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning at verse 6. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and in your gates. So immediately after commanding every Israelite to love Yahweh his God with all his heart, all his soul, and all his might, Moses told them that the words of God, the words God had given them through Moses, were to be present in every conscious moment of their lives, and they were to take special care to remember them always and to integrate them into every part of their lives. At the most basic level, then, this is what it means to love God, to love his law and treasure his word. Let me emphasize that this is the most basic level. There's a great deal more to be said about the love our Father wants from us, but for today, we will focus only on this, the beginning of how to keep the Great Commandment. We notice that Moses did not simply command Israel to obey the commandments of God's law. Simple compliance is not the point of God's law. Yet that is what many who heard Moses believed God wants. 3 times at Mount Sinai, Israel promised, what Yahweh has spoken we will do and be obedient. To be fair, the people at the foot of Mount Sinai had been slaves in Egypt less than 3 months earlier. When the Egyptians gave a commandment, compliance was exactly what they wanted. 40 years later, by the time Moses gave Deuteronomy, that generation was mostly gone. The people to whom Moses gave the Great Commandment had grown up with God in their midst, their lives governed by his laws and guided by his presence. This generation had experience living as the people of Yahweh. A little later, Moses extended those thoughts, closely joining love for Yahweh with obedience to his commandments. We read in Deuteronomy chapter 10, And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers, and chose their offspring after them, you above all peoples, as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. For the Lord your God is God of gods, and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. So why did God command his people and require them to keep his law? So that they would learn what he is like, and so that they would learn to be like their God, just as he is fair in his judgments and takes no bribe, just as he does justice for the fatherless and the widow, so also they are commanded to do. The law was more than a set of commandments to make for an orderly society. It was a teaching tool, and he wanted them to learn by doing and by thinking deeply about it every day. But Moses emphasized that Israel was not ready to give Yahweh the kind of obedience he wants when he told them in Deuteronomy 29, "Yet the Lord hath not given you an heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear, unto this day." God wants his people to hear what he is telling us, to see what he is showing us, to understand his law, and to obey with understanding and faith, rather than as slaves. Although it is by keeping his commandments that we show our love for Yahweh, it is true also that through keeping his commandments we learn to love him, seeing the commandments are good in themselves, and that in meditating on his word we learn about the Spirit of God, as we read in the Psalm, "O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him." To love Yahweh requires loving meditation and understanding of his law. It requires a heart to perceive, eyes to see, and ears to hear. But to understand at a scholarly level is to fall far short of what God wants. He wants us to love his law, to carry out his word in every action and in every thought. As the psalmist has written in Psalm 119, "Oh, how I love your law! It is my meditation all the day. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts. I hold back my feet from every evil way, in order to keep your word. I do not turn aside from your rules, for you have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth." It is important to emphasize that while God wants us to obey his laws, obedience as such is not what God wants from us. With all the rituals Israel learned in the law of Moses, God makes it clear that the rituals were not what he was after. We read in Isaiah, "Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me, new moon and Sabbath, and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them." Rather, God set out those laws and ordinances, intending his people should obey with understanding, and in following those rules that they should learn about what he really wanted. We read in Psalm 50, "I will not accept a bull from your house, or goats from your folds. For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. Do I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? Offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and perform your vows to the Most High, and call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." More broadly, by the prophet Micah, God summarized his law in this way, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" Now, we've been treating this mostly as an Old Testament subject, but it continues on into the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 23, we read of Jesus saying, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." Now, there is a great deal more to be said on this subject. Jesus' love for his Father is our greatest example. But this will do for a start. To show our love for God, we must learn to love his law and seek to understand him better by following and considering every word he has given us. For the next video, we will consider God's purpose in commanding us to love him. Until then, God be with you.